The first thing Lena noticed was how quiet the room got when she leaned over the table and spoke into the woman's ear. A soft, accidental whisper that landed like a stone. The restaurant's hum tapered into a hush. Forks paused midair. The central chandelier seemed to dim. She told the old woman only what she already knew in the way people tell each other the weather, but the syllables hit their marks like gunfire. Your niece, she's at St. Vincent's. She needs surgery. That was all. The woman's hands tightened on her tea. Her silver medallion caught fire from the candlelight. Lena saw the way her fingers curled around it as if to hold a compass to her chest. Across from Rosa Morty, Dominic Morty's table went silent the way a held breath does before a plunge. The boss looked up from his wine as if someone had spoken his name in a dream. Lena had worked the night shift at Carmine's for 3 years, wiping the same oak bar, memorizing the crooked accents of regulars, rehearsing apologies for spilled marinara, because that's what being small and polite in a room of men taught you. She was good at slipping into the background. That was how she fed her mother and kept her brother in community college. The money barely stretched. Hospital copays kept swallowing the weeks. And that's why Lena kept the envelope hidden inside the worn tips jar, why she counted out $20 bills the way some people counted prayers. She never intended for the Morty table to hear. She never intended for anything at all. But identity is a sloppy thing. It leaks when you think you've got it stitched up. And secrets are greedy. Dominic was a man built of old stories. Italian by blood, New Jersey by habit, a legend that moved through boroughs and docks like tide. He wore a watch with a glass face that always caught the light at the end of a story. People said he'd rebuilt neighborhoods, and ruin followed him like heat, both gifts and penalties. He was not a man who laughed a lot, but he laughed enough to let people know when he was pleased. That night, his face was a map of something else. Fatigue or calculation. Lena found it hard to tell the difference. When Rosa, his mother, touched the medallion against her throat, Dominic's jaw tightened in a way Lena could feel in her spine, and she knew, with the strange certainty of people who have been forced to watch violence too close, that the room had witnessed something more than a whisper. The hospital call came 2 nights later. Lena was wiping down the lone booth when her phone lit up. St. Vincent's, Trauma, Unit 3. Her hands shook as she dialed her brother. She had promised to be frugal with phone minutes, to hold them like clean things. Her mother's hand in the hospital hallway was warm and dry against the thin paper of a hospital gown. Machines breathed like distant trains. The photograph of a boy, cut down at 17 and yellow with age, sat on a clipboard by the bed. No caption, only an angle that made Lena's chest hollow. A nurse with tired eyes asked the usual questions, name, next of kin, while Lena tried to remember whether she'd eaten. She pressed the medallion she'd borrowed from the tips jar, an old charm with a small photograph inside, between her fingers, and felt the edges of both coin and memory. Outside the glass doors, ambulances slid by like black fish. Inside, a doctor's voice clipped away sensation like a blade. The room smelled of disinfectant and fried oil from the city. It smelled like something that ends and something that waits. They called it an incident at first, a bullet through glass, a patient caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The television in the waiting room played footage of the Morty name looping under a banner. Lena sat on a plastic chair that folded under her and watched Dominic's face on the screen, unmoved, speaking in soft, corporate sentences, while her mother clutched a hospital-issued blanket. Nurses fluttered in and out like moths. A medic on the unit said, half apologetic and half practiced, "Miss Alvarez, we need to run tests. There was shrapnel." Lena's knees wanted to give. Her mother kept pressing the medallion to her lips. When the doctor said the word surgery, she imagined the ledger of her life flipping open and showing all the unpaid lines. She thought about the envelope beneath the bar and a tiny ledger she kept in her head where every small kindness, every shift, every tip, was graded for its ability to keep fear at bay. In the days that followed, the city threaded itself through Lena like a needle. She moved in a slow, automatic way between Carmine's and the hospital, between the fluorescent glare of a deli and the soft-lit chapel, where she sat and counted rosary beads with hands that trembled from lack of sleep. Dominic's men came in and out of the restaurant like constellations. leaving lines of cigarette smoke and whispered orders. They tipped as if to claim the kindness belonged to them now. Rosa Morty visited the hospital every night, the same medallion at her throat, and Lena watched the way Dominic watched his mother. One evening, when the waiter's shift changed and the city hummed below, Lena found a folded envelope tucked behind a bottle of house red. A receipt with a name she didn't know and a number that didn't fit her math. It was small, only a ledger entry scribbled in a hurried hand. Payment to St. Vincent's, and beneath it another line. For Maria paid. Lena's fingers left sweat smudges on its margin. Maria. The name grazed like a foreign coin she'd once hidden in the tip's jar and forgotten. She carried the scrap in her pocket and didn't know why the word made her think of childhood. Curiosity is a dangerous thing when you live in rooms full of men who measure danger in degrees and favors. Lena told herself she was checking because bills needed to be paid, but the deputy's look at the ledger was another kind of ignition. Detective Heron had the face of someone who'd learned to make decisions at 3 a.m. He was practical, and his kindness had the heat of tools. He sat with Lena on a faded bench in the hospital corridor and asked about the envelope without ceremony. Lena's mouth wanted to clench. She'd been taught that the right thing to do was to stay quiet. Silence had kept her mother alive before. But secrets sometimes belong to more than one person, and you can hear them in more ears than yours. "Who's Maria?" Heron asked. Lena's voice was a thread. "No idea," she said, and lied as if the truth would be a splinter beneath his palm. Then came the first reveal, not cinematic and not clean, but small and true. Rosa Morty's medallion, when Lena managed to see the tiny photograph inside, contained the image of a young woman. Lena's face at age 6, hair in uneven braids, the same freckle on the cheek that Lena rubbed when thinking too hard. The shock felt like a physical object dislodging somewhere in her chest. Lena had kept a single photograph from her mother's belongings, the one where a nurse had smiled and placed a small girl on a hospital bed. But she had never given a name to that image, and the story around it had been a patchwork of found and we managed. The medallion's photograph answered a question Lena hadn't known she'd been permitted to ask. She slipped her fingers under Rosa's collar while the woman dozed in a plastic chair and saw the inscription on the ring. "Per la mia promessa," for my promise. The watch on Dominic's wrist ticked away like a metronome in a song that Lena suddenly remembered. Every small object in the room seemed to rearrange itself until a silhouette of meaning emerged. Someone had been keeping something for years. That night, Lena couldn't sleep because the city refused to be small. She dreamed of a ledger, thick, bound in black, filled with names that bled into one another. In the morning, she went to the restaurant and found a door unlocked in the back she hadn't known existed. A narrow staircase that wound down into a basement no one ever mentioned. The air down there smelled of old oil and dust. Beneath a stack of empty wine cases, she found a door with a rusted lock. It yielded to a gentle push. Inside was a room, more a hide than a proper office, lined with boxes and a metal cabinet. On top of the cabinet lay a leather ledger, the kind used to keep accounts and secrets. Lena's hands hovered above it like a diver at the rim of a deep pool. She lifted it, the spine sighed. Inside were names, payments, dates, rows of numbers like a map. There was an entry dated 11 years ago. Deutsche Klinik payment for Alvarez, $3,200. Beneath it, a terse note. Confirmed, Rosa M. The tiny script made a hard, clear line through Lena's unsteady life. This was the medium reveal. The ledger in the basement was a book of favors, payments that bought silence and surgery, and sometimes the kind of anonymity that erased footprints. Lena turned pages and found an index of other items. A photograph with a date scrawled in the corner, a mention of a watch serial numbers, and a note saying, "Given to D by R, the watch that Dominic wore." The photograph was creased and tucked into a ledger's fold. Lena smoothed it and felt the paper's history. It showed a young woman and a boy on a stoop. The boy's face was a ghost of Dominic's. The woman was Rosa or someone like her, and tucked in the corner of the frame was the faded imprint of a hospital bracelet. In the photo, a small girl in a polka-dotted dress, Lena, by an absence of doubt, clutched a ragged teddy. Her stomach hollowed. The ledger was not an accident, it was a system. Someone had tracked the cost of saving lives like inventory. Secrets are transactional. When Lena opened the ledger in the empty basement, the city's tide turned in a different direction. It was the kind of discovery that shifts people from being characters in someone else's script to being the author of their own chapter. And when Detective Heron saw the ledger, his face changed the way weather changes across a bay. The kind of sudden steel that follows the understanding of leverage. "You have to be careful," he said, not like a policeman, but like a man trying to keep an ember from lighting a whole forest. But in their world, embers were precisely what people traded in, and the ledger had already set too many things alight to be smothered now. The interrogation happened in a room with a table too small for the weight of what was being asked. Lena found herself sat opposite Dominic, her hands folded, while Heron watched from the doorway like a tide gazer. Dominic's face was a polished mask, her face at 6, and the medallion had rearranged the pieces, yet there was something fragile in the lines around his eyes. He asked direct questions that looked like offers. "Where'd you get the medallion? Why did you open our basement?" Lena answered with the same politeness that had kept her alive, and yet the truth had a new contour in her mouth. She said, "Because I thought someone should know." That sentence landed on the table like a coin. They asked about payment lists. Lena said she didn't know why the ledger mentioned her name. She could feel Dominic watching every syllable, as if words were stones, and he judged them for weight. Betrayal unfolded slow as mildew in the interrogation room. When Heron slid a photograph across the table, one she had not seen before, Lena recognized the boy curled in the photo as the one who used to stand on the stoop when she was small. The boy's expression was identical to a man she'd seen take off his hat in the restaurant, Dominic, with a face that softened when he thought no one was looking. The photograph was of a backyard, a makeshift crib, and a woman handing a baby to a man with steady hands. Lena's heart did a strange thing. It was a small, subterranean seizure. "Why would they pay for my surgery if I'm nothing to them?" she asked, voice thin. Heron didn't answer with words. Instead, he pushed another envelope across to her. Bank statements, dates, a small memo. Private care, Alvarez child arrangement. The betrayal was of a curious order. It was not just a theft of money, it was the theft of context, of why her mother had moved their lives in the way she did. Someone had chosen to keep Lena safe, but separate, as if shelter could exist without explanation. By then, the city had begun to hum with other engines. The news cycle had a new arc and Dominic's name was part of it. He had ructions with other families, deals that had rusted, and the ledger's existence like a thin candle in a windless room meant there would be people who wanted to tidy up loose ends. Lena felt that in the way the men at Carmine's began to fall quiet when she approached, in the way a delivery truck heaved its back much later than usual. The world in which Lena was merely a shy waitress was closing like a hand. She wanted to tell her mother everything, but what did you say when the thing you loved was stitched into the fabric of danger? She kept the picture from the medallion under her pillow and slept badly. Then came the ambush, fast, clinical, the way a bad dream attends to routine. Lena left the hospital after visiting hours with a bag of uneaten food and a small plastic carrier filled with lilies for the night nurse. The street was slick with rain and neon, the city dissolving into a watercolor of lights. A van slowed beside her. Men stepped out like punctuation. The world reduced to the smell of wet leather and the metallic click of a door. They grabbed her with practiced hands. Lena tried to scream but found the cry too large for her mouth. It folded like linen. They shoved her into the van, blindfolded her with the hem of a jacket, and the city went away. The kidnapping was not random. It was precise. They bundled her into a place that smelled of diesel and old paper, an abandoned warehouse off the Newark Turnpike, where light came through slats making bars on the floor. The first man who removed her blindfold had Dominic's watch on his wrist, glinting as he moved. Lena's heart slammed the way a fist hits glass. She tasted copper. Her hands trembled as if they had become instruments of someone else's fear. The raid on the warehouse came with the sound of boots and the authority of blue lights hitting corrugated steel. Heron had arranged it. His jaw had set like someone who had decided to take a risk he did not have permission for. Lena watched men move through the darkness like ghosts and felt something fierce and small rise up, fear married to a kind of furious clarity. The men grabbed the men who had grabbed her. They handcuffed them and lined them like dolls. One of them looked at Lena with something like regret. Dominic arrived in a different way. Not at the front, but through a side opening, his face a cut of ice that did not thaw even when he saw her. There would be 1,000 stories told about that night, some with more embellishment than truth, but Lena remembered the particular way the light caught Dominic's watch and how his eyes, so practiced at containing feeling, flickered and broke. It was the first time she'd seen him lose control, not in fury, but in something closer to recognition. "You shouldn't have done that." He said it to Heron, not to her, but the sentence traveled. His voice was low enough that it could be a warning or a lament. Heron didn't answer with anger. He answered with thin calculation. They took Lena to a safe room where detectives and federal agents had a staggered, antiseptic air about them. She sat on a plastic chair and watched Dominic, who seemed to become smaller when stripped of his entourage, less myth and more man. He walked toward her like a man approaching the edge of a memory. The watch on his wrist had a scratch across its face, a bar of silver interrupting the black. Lena recognized the pattern because she had seen it years ago in the reflection of a shop window. The scratch matched the freckle on her hand. Dominic's breathing was a steady metronome, and the silence between them was heavy with things not yet said. This was the scene where he lost control. It wasn't a flare of violence. It was a crack in his composure, a flash of the child behind the man, when he said, "You look like her." Then he took off his watch and laid it on the table like an offering and stared at it as if it were a map to somewhere he could not go. For a long time he spoke about debts and obligations and a ledger that had been kept to protect and to hide. "We kept a ledger," he said. "My mother kept a ledger the size of a book. We paid for things we could not undo." He looked at Lena as if she were both his question and his answer. His hands trembled once and then steadied. People had 1,000 violent ways to show weakness. Dominic chose the smallness of a gesture, the pulling off of an object that had always been a shield. Lena wanted to stand, but felt rooted. She wanted to ask whether kindness could be reclassified as ownership. He watched her as if trying to read a map written in a child's handwriting. In the quiet that followed, Lena found her voice. She stood up slow, incredulous, as if the muscles in her legs were strangers, and looked Dominic straight in the face. "You didn't keep me safe," she said. It was simple, small, and terrible. "You kept me hidden." Her words did not aim to wound, but to lay bare how small courtesies had been sold at the auction of power. "My mother did what she had to do," she added, and the way she said it suggested both affection and accusation. Dominic's face hardened and then softened and then, finally, the mask fell. His grief, so carefully managed, broke into a ragged thing that frightened him more than anyone else in the room. He spoke then, not as a boss, but as a man who had made arrangements with his life he could not easily undo. "We thought we were protecting you. We thought." He stopped as if the next words would choke him, and in that silence Lena saw something new. The boss being human and angry at himself for being so. After that, everything turned toward the ledger and the photograph like iron filings to a magnet. Heron demanded accountings. Federal agents asked about payments and offshore transfers. Rosa, for the first time in years, sat with a small, incriminating ledger on her lap and explained in halting sentences why they had done what they did. She told a story of favors and doctors, and a debt that had once been named honor. She told Lena that years ago a decision had been made to keep a child from danger by removing her from a life that included a man with enemies. Somebody had taken responsibility and called it love. There was a photo Rosa had kept, folded in the ledger. A day at Coney Island, a man with Dominic's set jaw pushing a little girl on a carousel horse. Lena's fingers found the crease. The picture was small and honest. It unraveled the edges of what propped them both up. The mid-story twist arrived not with shattering violence but with clinical certainty, DNA results. Heron, who had the terrible kindness of some detectives, had insisted on a test. Lena had resisted for the way tests feel like verdicts, like a judge's hand coming down. But then a genetist with gentle hands and a tired smile explained the science in a voice like a teacher. The test was clear. Lena and Dominic shared genetic markers that were not trivial, that pointed to shared blood and a parentage that matched what the photograph suggested. It was quicker than a confession and cleaner than a ledger. Lena's world spun. She felt the floor she'd stood on for decades shift under her. She wanted to scream with the realness of it, or to laugh, or to sit very still until time moved on. She thought of the medallion and the photo, and how a silver disc around a throat could be a kind of map. If the ledger was proof that favors can be bought, the DNA test was a proof that biology is not so easily bartered. People reacted in the ways they always do when new information reorganizes their lives, some with tenderness and some with predatory interest. The Morty family faced a public unraveling. Rival families smelled advantage. The legal apparatus clicked into place like a machine. Lena's name shifted in the media from waitress to possible kin, a label that left her uneasily exposed. Her mother cried at night and woke with the shaped quiet of someone who had carried a secret for so long that to release it felt like falling. Rosa's ring, inscribed with a promise, rested on the nightstand like a small, heavy truth. Lena began to count the objects again. The medallion that held a photograph, the ledger that tracked favors, the ring with its inscription, Dominic's watch with its scratched face, the photograph itself. They were like knots in a rope, each tied to the other until the rope was whole and impossible to ignore. If the ledger and the DNA were the medium reveals, the game changer came in a darker, almost mundane way. It was a recorded conversation, one which the ledger's margins had hinted at, but which nobody expected to find in the dusty bowels of the restaurant's secret room. An old voicemail, archived by some neat hand, was played in a courtroom-quality audio room where federal agents stood with the perfect gravity of their profession. In it, Rosa's voice arranged a payment and spoke of a child as if coordinating a delivery. The voice said the words, "Keep her safe," and a man's voice, Dominic's, replied with a promise. The recording was not violent. It was transactional, the kind of ordinary language used to move resources across lines. But it sealed the ledger's implications. The Mortys had not merely aided Lena's family, they had approached their involvement with the calculus of power. The revelation reframed everything. Kindness folded into control, generosity into ownership. For the city, for the families, for Lena, it was the pivot point where the story became larger than anyone's private calculus. With that revelation came consequences. Dominic found himself under pressure from squares in his life that had formerly been willing to overlook small indiscretions. His rivals sharpened statements about things they had long suspected. The ledger made paper of accusations that had once been rumor. Federal agents pushed for a deal. Dominic retreated to ancient instincts. One night, in the dim of his mother's kitchen, he smashed his fist into a photograph and the glass spidered. His voice, raw and human, spooled out into the quiet. Lena, who had come to ask something as small as a conversation, watched him lose control and felt a complex empathy that surprised her. She saw how his hands shook when the watch clicked and how triumph and loss sat in the same rack in his chest. "We tried to protect you," he whispered. It was not an excuse, merely a confession that hurt him to make. The showdown that followed was not a single moment of cinematic gunplay, but a series of decisions that compounded until law felt like a web closing tight. Dominic offered a public admission to certain transactions in an effort to keep more dangerous things from surfacing. Federal prosecutors used the ledger to negotiate guilty pleas from some of Dominic's lesser associates. The Morty name stayed in the paper, but Dominic himself absented from street life with legal maneuvers that looked an awful lot like arrangements designed to save a family name. It was not clean justice. It was the law working within the messy skein of human relationships. Lena watched the courtroom proceedings with a kind of sober awe, realizing that public payoff could be a weird plaster over private wounds. Yet there was something restorative in the ledger's exposure. Debt was counted and recorded, and paper compensated for blood in ways that the heart had not foreseen. Amid the public disorder, Lena's personal life reorganized into an unexpected stability. She stayed at Carmine's an extra shift to keep the bills flowing and enrolled in night classes to finish the degree she had postponed for money. She asked for a photo from Dominic. One, just one, of his hand holding the medallion, and he left a packet on the table at Carmine's one rainy morning. A photograph, a note, and his watch. The note said nothing elaborate. It said, "I kept a ledger, I kept a promise, I am sorry." The watch, when she held it, felt heavier than she thought it would. Its scratches were a map. Lena found herself forgiving, and furiously refusing, to let forgiveness be currency. She wanted to call it something honest, a complicated mercy. She wanted to be firm in asking that her mother not be sacrificial, that their choices be recognized for what they were: survival. There was one scene that the newspapers did not run because it was too small to be sensational and too personal to be political. Lena confronting Dominic in the dim light of an empty Carmine's, the kitchen steamy with dishes and the smell of lemon and garlic. She stood with the photograph of herself at 6, clutched like evidence, and Dominic watched. He had returned the medallion to Rosa, and Rosa had smiled at him like a woman who had bargained and lost and gained strange mercies. Lena's voice was a tight wire as she said, "Did you ever ask me?" Dominic closed his eyes and the world seemed to tilt. "I wanted to," he said. "I was afraid that asking would ruin you." The idea that a question could be dangerous had a corrosive logic to it. Lena felt a new emotion then, less like rage and more like a precise, cold making, the will to be seen on her own terms. The raid, the ledger, the DNA, the recordings, each of these things pushed the plot along toward public resolution, but Lena's transformation was quieter and inward. She began to learn to sit with things without being swallowed by them. She took classes in the evenings, learned to speak up at staff meetings, negotiated a small raise, and paid the hospital bills in installments. She visited her mother without the hush of urgent secrecy and started to tell stories, small ones, out loud. Rosa's promise ring remained in a velvet box on the mantel, a small, heavy thing that had bought and sold their lives in equal measure. Lena would take it out sometimes and turn it in her palm like a prayer. There were still dangerous people who wanted the ledger's blood. A rival family attempted a deniable sabotage. A black sedan on a bridge, a smear of men trying to make an accident look accidental, a threat rolled like fog. This time, the city's layers of protection had thicker seams. Heron and a federal team intervened before the planned crash, changing cars and routes as if they were performing a surgery. Lena watched from the back seat with a knotted stomach and an odd sense of being conducted. When the moment passed, when men were hauled away in cuffs and the night sky reopened, she felt a relief that tasted like late coffee. Heron put his hand briefly on her shoulder in a way that was less patronizing than previously. It felt like an acknowledgement that she had borne witness, and that she was not the only person who had to find a way through. By the time the last legal papers were signed, and Dominic accepted a deal that took him away from streets he had built his life on, away from the role that had shaped him into a public figure, there was a small, private reckoning. The public payoff had been a plea agreement that avoided the most violent of reckonings. Dominic's family paid fines, some were jailed, and some moved away. The ledger's public unveiling had fractured alliances, but it had also forced the Mortys to face the ledger's moral arithmetic. Dominic's most painful concession was to accept responsibility, publicly, not out of theatrics, but because he wanted the ledger's edges to lie flat, even if he had to kneel to make that happen. He told the court about payments and favors, and about a house where a small girl played with a worn teddy. The testimony was the kind of theater justice produces, a mix of sorrow and accountability that left no one wholly satisfied, but which set the terms for moving forward. The personal payoff came in an afternoon that had the peculiar clarity of a summer storm after a dry month. Lena and Dominic stood in the hospital garden, where hydrangeas leaned heavy, and the sky was the color of clean glass. He gave her the medallion, the photograph inside now replaced by a new one. Lena at 26, hair pulled back, standing in a class with her diploma in her hands. He had had it remade, the photograph new and the medallion softened by years. "Keep it," he said, "not because it binds you, but because you wanted to be remembered." Lena took it, feeling the cool metal on her skin. It was not a sign of ownership, but a relic of what had been and what might yet be. In that small exchange there was a reconciliation, not total, not beautiful in a movie way, but honest. The epilogue of public life had bureaucratic neatness. Settlements, court filings, orders of protection for Rosa, and for Lena when threats still loomed like the last leaves clinging to a winter branch. People wrote articles that tried to simplify the story into neat metaphors of family and crime. Lena skimmed them like someone reading postcards from an older life. In private, she and her mother built new rituals around the objects that had once been shackles. The medallion sat on a shelf not as evidence, but as history. The ledger was digitized and turned over to authorities. The watch was polished and placed in a drawer where its scratch no longer defined a life. Lena bought a new notebook and wrote her own ledger. Classes taken, shifts worked, bills paid. She taught herself to be the accountant of her own days. In the quietest hour, when night had folded the city into its familiar hum and the smell of fried basil drifted from Carmine's, Lena would sometimes take the small photograph out and look at it. She would trace the line of her childhood face with a finger and remember the sound of her mother whispering, the hush of a table, the way that a single word recorded on a ledger could alter the course of more than one life. She learned that words could be weapons and salves, that objects could hold both accusation and solace. The ring, the medallion, the ledger, the watch, the photograph, each returned to her in a different role. Proof, evidence, a tool, a memory, a promise. When the story closed into its last quiet chapter, Lena stayed at Carmine's, but no longer merely to survive. She had a job that paid better. She went to class. She walked home with the surety of someone who had learned to carry more than fear. Dominic's presence in the city diminished, not erased, but shifted into other forms: legal settlements, charitable donations that read like penance, and the odd unannounced gesture that suggested a complicated love. Rosa's medallion stayed polished on the mantel until she moved to a smaller home and gave Lena a box of objects with a smile like a confession. "We did what we thought was right," she said, and in the pause there was both apology and vindication. Lena accepted the box and its weight. The city keeps its own ledger. People make choices and the city records them in small ways. In headlines, in court filings, in a watch left on a table. Lena learned to live with the knowledge that someone could have tried to own her story and that those attempts, by ledger and by promise, were part of her past but not her future. She taught herself to ask questions, to stand firmly when necessary, and to speak softly when the hush of a room demanded it. Once, when Rosa came to Carmine's and sat at the bar with the medallion on her neck and the ring on her hand, Lena leaned across the counter, and in a whisper meant to be a question and a benediction both, she said, "We're all right." The hush that followed was not the silence of a table that feared a boss. It was the quiet of two people who had survived something and decided to make room for repair. Life, after all, was less about the ledger and more about the small accounts you keep with people. Lena's records were no longer only about unpaid bills. They were a tally of small mercies: the time a nurse stayed 5 extra minutes, the one check that was finally cashed, the class she aced, the small tuition payment that came through. She cataloged them like evidence of a slow reclamation. The city would continue to breathe its humid breath, and the Morty name would circulate with the same complicated aroma it always had. But Lena had found a life where she could cultivate the small, steady truths. She learned that standing up to the most dangerous person in the room wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was merely speaking in a voice that refused to be small any longer. In the end, the whisper that had silenced a table grew into something audible and firm: a conversation, a public accounting, and a private forgiveness tempered by truth. Lena kept the medallion and the photograph and added them to the life she was building, small objects that no longer bound her but narrated a redemption that was messy and human. Dominic took his consequences and, in time, found a way to sit with the ledger he had helped create. His public life shifted into things that could not erase the past, but could, perhaps, begin to repair it. Rosa lived out her days with a measure of peace and the ring on her finger like a closed sentence. And Lena, once shy, folded into the background like a napkin, learned to keep her own ledger. She learned to whisper into ears that would listen and to speak up to faces that had once silenced her. The city, in its way, kept the rest. The medallion's photograph, the ledger's pages, the watch's scratch, the ring on a small finger, the photograph on the mantel. They were a constellation of things that had once been used to hide and now, finally, helped tell what had happened. On the last page of her own book, she wrote a simple line and pinned it to the inside of the cover. We survived. We counted. Outside Carmine's, the lights of the city shivered like a promise, and Lena stepped out into them with a pocket full of proofs and a head full of plans. She breathed the night in and held her medallion close, not as an anchor but as a map to a life reclaimed.